Once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world, even more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren in Colorado, in Kansas, in Georgia, in Missouri, in Texas, in Chicago, Illinois, in Arkansas, in California, in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Canada, Fiji Island, Mexico, Spain, Africa, Kenya, Pakistan, Zambia, to the United Kingdom, to our brethren in Australia, and also to our brethren in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, and to the rest of the 144,000 living saints scattered abroad. Greetings. May the good Lord bless you, my dear brothers and sisters. This is our special episode number 47, just an hour exposition of the prophecy as the last final warning message. And still, we focus our attention to the subject, the 11th hour, from the parabolical 11th hour to the parabolical sunset. This subject is quite broad and wide, and we need to gather all the inspired statements given by the Shepherd's Rod and harmonize all of them, because the Word of God will never contradict each other. And accordingly, in track number 5, on page 36, it says, when each is carefully joined in its right relation in the picture of revealed truth, one leading on to and illuminating another, the great overall design stands out in all the solemn majesty of its mountainous finality and grandeur. Track number 5, page 36. Now, I would like to read track number 12 on pages 34 and page 35. It says, this hour which brings the death throes of Babylon can be none other than that which, according to Jesus' parable in Matthew 20, verse 11 to 16, is the last parabolic hour, period, of the day, provisionary time. That is from the 11th hour call for laborers, the last message to the world, Malachi 4 verse 5, to the 12th hour, sunset, ancient timepiece, the end of the day, the close of the gospel period, Matthew 24 verse 14, the close of the harvest, Jeremiah 8 verse 20, the close of provision, Revelation 22 verse 11. So in this reading, brothers and sisters, the particular object in view in the subject, the 11th hour, is the period while provisionary time still lingers. And according to that reading, sunset, which is the end of the day, that is the close of the harvest. And the quotation is Jeremiah 8 verse 20. So let us focus now our attention to the subject, the harvest. The subject concerning the harvest, we know it is divided into two periods. The harvest that pertains to the dead and the harvest that pertains to the living. But since our subject is the 11th hour, undoubtedly that period of time is referred only to the harvest that pertains to the living. Now I would like to read 2TG number 11, pages 12 and page 13. It says, for example, after the harvest, investigative judgment of the dead is past. Other truths, even more important, must be introduced for the harvest of the living. I say more important truths because they are concerning the living themselves, concerning those whose own cases are to be weighed in the balances, those who personally are to be judged either as wheat or as tares, either as good fish or as bad fish. 2TG 11, pages 12 and 13. So the subject, the harvest, is also divided into two sections. The harvest, which is investigative judgment, and the harvest, which is executive judgment. But, of course, it is even more directly applied to the investigative judgment. According to Answerer number 2 on page 36. It says, is not the harvest the end of the world? Answerer number 2, page 36. Do not forget the statement in 3 symbolic code, number 5 and 6, page 12, saying, when we have come to the last hour of the day, from 5 to 6 p.m., we recognize the fact that we are in the end of the day, even though the last minute has not yet come. Likewise, inasmuch as Christ's parable of the vineyard is true to life, then according to physical analogy, we can understand the last hour, the 11th, of the symbolical day of present human history to be only the end of the world. What is the period called the 11th hour? It says it is the end of the world. And according to answerer number 2, page 36, is not the harvest the end of the world? Answer, yes. According to the statement in question, the harvest is the end of provisionary time, taking place at, not after, the close of provision. And the fact that the investigative judgment acts upon one's case after his life career in relation to salvation has ended, and while provision still lingers, is another proof that the harvest is the last part of provisionary time. This accords with Jeremiah's statement, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Jeremiah 8 verse 20. It shows that the harvest is a period of time, having a beginning and ending, and that during its time, men are saved. And early writings, page 118, reveals that the third angel is the one who does the harvesting, while Matthew 13 verse 30 shows also that the angels separate the tares from the wheat in the time of harvest. Answerer number 2, page 36. So, the shepherd's rod plainly told us that the end of the world is the harvest, which is the investigative judgment. But the 11th hour is pertaining to the investigative judgment concerning the living. The shepherd's rod plainly declared in tract number 3, page 43, saying, as the cleansings called for in the parables and in Malachi's prophecy have never taken place, the investigative judgment of the living is obviously then yet future. We know it was written on 1934. The prophet himself plainly declared that the investigative judgment of the living was still future in his days, which is the period of the 11th hour. And here in answerer number 2, page 93, it says, obvious is this fact because the nations among themselves have always been angry and are angry even today, although we are still in the time of the judgment of the dead. This was written 1944. So the prophet made it so plain that they were still living in the period, the judgment that pertains to the dead. Now, here in 12 symbolic code number 3, page 21, it says, you will find that the message consistently teaches that the judgment of the living has not yet commenced, that we are still living in the time of the judgment of the dead. So that is very plain. The message teaches that the judgment of the living was still future in the days of B.T. Hodder, or called the harvest concerning the living. And that harvest is called investigative judgment, being provisionary time. And that period of the harvest is divided into 2 sections. The first section is called the beginning of the harvest, and the second is called the ending of the harvest. Now, let us read again the statement in answerer number 2, page 36. It says, it shows that the harvest is a period of time, having a beginning and ending, and that during its time, men are saved. So the harvest is divided into 2 periods. And the first section is called the beginning of the harvest. Now, I would like to read tract number 5 on page 74. It says, it will be noted that the 144,000 are called the first fruits, denoting that they are sealed at the beginning of the harvest. So the voice of inspiration is very plain. The 144,000 living saints is spiritual Israel. They are sealed at the first section of the harvest, which is called the beginning of the harvest. We already read, right, that the harvest is a period of time having two sections. The first section is the beginning of the harvest. The second section is the ending of the harvest. Both in two periods is called provisionary time. But we will focus our attention to the first section of the harvest, which is called the beginning of the harvest, by which in that period of time, the 144,000 living saints are to be sealed in the period called the beginning of the harvest. I would like to read track number 3 on page, let's read, page 64. Track number 3, page 64. It says, though the true meaning and time of the harvest is greatly confused by some and confusing to many, a close study of the word will clear it in just a simple manner as it cleared both the time of the seed sowing and the period of the wheat and the tares. So here, the shepherd's rod plainly told us that we need to closely study the subject concerning the harvest, by which to some it is confusing subject. But I do fully believe to the honest and faithful who study the Word of God sincerely and honestly, as stated in this reading, through the guidance of the Spirit of Christ, it will clear in a simple manner according to the voice of inspiration. I remember, brethren, the statement in 1 TG or Timely Greetings, 1 TG number 1, pages 14 and page 15. So let's read the reading. It says, the ant knows what to do and when to do it, and does it. It never fails to make a living, though it has no boss. Were you to go down into its house, you would find provisions for more than the season requires. It knows when harvest comes and knows how to make the most of it. If a man fails to do as the ant, if he fails to take notice of the time and of the season, then his miseries shall certainly increase. So this reading, the voice of inspiration, used the example of the ant. The ant knows when the harvest will come and made a preparation for it. But how about us? More particularly to the people in the last generation. I remember the statement in 2SR 147 saying, will you, brother, will you, sister, adorn yourself with the righteousness of Christ? Or will you wait a little longer until after the harvest is past? Someone shall utter the following words in great disappointment. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Jeremiah 8:20. Shall you or shall I? Hoping not one of us to be among that people predicted beforehand that in bitter disappointment, with lamentation, they cried out, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and they became alarmed that they were not saved, or they failed to obtain the seal of the living God. Brothers and sisters, we as Shepherd's Rod believer, all of us understood that in order for us to receive the seal of the living God, we need to sigh and cry for all the abominations that be done in our midst. But that is not the only description given in the Spirit prophecy. Even the non-Shepherd's Rod believer, if you are familiar, Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, and some of them called Seventh-day Adventist International Missionary Society, and with many others. Also, all of them, they were sighing and crying in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in the Mother Church, because of the thought that in order to receive the seal of the living God, we need to sigh and cry. But in reality, even the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they also sighing and crying to the Christian world, non-Sabbath keepers. That is the way that they sigh and cry. But here in 1SR, page 31, I would like to read, it says, speaking of the 144,000, volume 5, pages 210 and 211 says, these sighing, crying ones had been holding forth the words of life, a message. So they were holding the words of life, a message. What is that message that they were holding? I would like to read again, 2 Symbolic Code 5 and 6, page 2 Symbolic Code 5 and 6. page 9. It says, as long as you keep wavering on present truth, your sighing and crying will be too feeble and insufficient to place the seal of God in your forehead. I would like to read again, 2 Symbolic Code, 5 and 6, page 9. As long as you keep wavering on present truth, your sighing and crying will be too feeble and insufficient to place the seal of God in your forehead. So it is not just simply to sigh and cry. Only those who sigh and cry that will receive the seal of the living God in their foreheads. But if you are sighing and crying without the present truth, you are not holding in your hands the present truth. The present truth is not in your possession. No, it is not sufficient to place the seal of God in our foreheads. Logically, because the saints of God in all ages are sealed with present truth. How could you be able to receive the seal of the living God if you are destitute of the present truth? It says here, 1 SR page 28, according to these scriptures, which are plainly stated, we must conclude that the saints of God are sealed with present truth in all ages. And whatever that present truth is, that is the seal. For sure, brothers and sisters, there must be present truth under the seventh seal. Otherwise, how could they obtain the seal if there is no present truth? And the shepherd says in 2 SR page 202, but the seventh sealing period, being the last, must concern the living. 2 SR page 202, but the seventh sealing period, being the last, must concern the living. All the present truths that had been bestowed by God, because present truth cometh from God, according to 11 Symbolic Code, number 3, page 5. Man does not know the seasons. It says here in 11 Symbolic Code, number 3, page 5. Present truth comes only from God. Man does not know the seasons, and therefore God Himself must appoint the time for present truth to be revealed. We as human beings are liable to commit mistakes and error. Even the prophet are not exempted. So only God knows the time for present truth to be revealed. Now the present truth under the seventh seal, God will not bestow such present truth in the period of the sixth seal, because that present truth is intended under the seventh seal. And remember, brothers and sisters, the present truth cometh only from God. But God deposited that present truth in the church He acknowledged as His church. That is why the shepherd's rod declared clearly in 2 SR 125, I would like to read. It says, God's church is well marked in every generation by obedience to present truth. 2 SR page 125. So God's church is well marked in every generation, meaning all generations, by obedience to present truth. So the divine ear mark that you could recognize that is the church recognized by Jesus Christ as His is through the present truth. The same with the statement in tract number 14. On page 38, it says, to know their church aright through timely truth is what brings life eternal. Tract number 14, page 38. To know their church aright through timely truth is what brings life eternal. So, the only way that you could ascertain clearly that is the right church, because the timely truth, the present truth, is deposited by God into that church. Now, since we are studying the 11th hour, of course, it must be the 11th hour church. There must be a specific truth bestowed by God to that 11th hour church. Brethren, we need to humbly admit that the movement which was raised by God from 1930 to 1955, it is not a church. It is just an association. For at that time, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was still recognized by God as His church. It was not yet cast out. The shepherd's rod declared clearly, it says here, in 2 Symbolic Code, number 10, page 6, demoted but not yet cast out. 2 Symbolic Code, number 10, page 6. So in the days of B.T. Hawthorne, although the Seventh-day Adventist Church was demoted, of course, demotion meaning from high rank to the lower rank. But in this instance, we can easily understand that such demotion is that the channel of revelation of truth from heaven is no longer channeled to the Seventh-day Adventist leadership. It was channeled to the allegorical Jezreel. Jezreel is the eldest son, but Jezreel is not the wife. The wife still represents the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And one of the principal reasons why God raised up Jezreel is to deliver the message of reconciliation. Now, I would like to read tract number 4, page 5. Jezreel's introductory appeal. There am I, and Ruhama. With deepest anxiety, I am writing to implore you to make overtures to our estranged mother, that we may effect her reconciliation, save our father from his inconsolable grief, and regladden our now unhappy home. So, the message which was entrusted by God to allegorical Jezreel, which is Beti-Hotep, in that days is a message of reconciliation. But there is a boundary line. Brothers and sisters, when such boundary line arrive, then there must be final decision coming from the Father. If they continually reject the message, then God raised up allegorical Jezreel to deliver the message of rejection. And of course, the very message recorded here on the old symbolic code, I would like to read. 3 symbolic code, number 5 and 6, page 4. 3 symbolic code, number 5 and 6, page 4. It says, plead with your mother. Plead for saith the Lord, she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. This message cannot be applied in reality in the days of Beti-Hotep. Because in the days of Beti-Hotep, God still recognized the Seventh-day Adventist Church as his wife, although she is in apostasy. But God gave a period of time to repent. The same with the Jewish nation. There is a period of time that had been given to repent. But when they continually reject the message until the period of time given expired in October 16, 34 AD, the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9, they had been rejected by God. Now, brothers and sisters, that message in 3 symbolic code, 5 and 6, page 4, that is a message of rejection. Complete denial, saying, she is not my wife. Brothers and sisters, the voice of inspiration says in 2SR 125, God has never had more than one movement in existence at a time, and it could not be otherwise now, for Christ cannot be divided. The same with the statement on 2SR page 225, it says, therefore the vineyard is the world, and those sent to labor in it are the church. The parable cannot refer to one literal day of 12 hours, into which God has made 5 calls for laborers in the vineyard world. For there is no record where God raised 5 church organizations in one day and had them operating all at the same time. So the voice of inspiration is plainly telling, brothers and sisters, that there is no such record that God raised up 2 churches the same period of time. And since Beti-Hotep was living in the period of the 9th hour church, indicating that Beti-Hotep was living in a period of time by which the 9th hour church, which is the Seventh-day Adventist Church, was still recognized by God as his church. But when God raised up the 11th hour church, plainly indicates that that is the time by which God rejected the 9th hour church. What is the 9th hour church? The Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, I would like to read tract number 8. Here in tract number 8, page 47, page 48. Why David a type? Inevitably because he is the only one who perfectly fits the antitype. The leadership in the time of the loud cry of the third angel's message. This being so, then it necessarily follows that Saul, the first king who reigned over Israel and was largely responsible for the early experience of David's life, is a type of the church leadership in the period preceding the loud cry. The leadership which was raised up in 1844 and for the sole purpose of gathering the 144,000, the first fruits of the kingdom, in its case, type perfectly matches antitype. Now the statement says, in its case, type perfectly matches antitype. What is the Seventh-day Adventist Church leadership? It is antitypical Saul. When God rejected Saul, brothers and sisters, and God anointed David at that time, brothers and sisters, Saul was still alive. So, in the antitype, it must be the same. What is the representation of David? The leadership in the time of the loud cry of the third angel's message. Although the subject, the loud cry, still, it seems, not clearly understood, even among shepherd's rod believers. Because when they read loud cry, they immediately jump to the conclusion that it is loud cry to the great multitude, which no man could number. But the absolute fact is that, here in tract number 1, on page 20, it says, since the purification or the sealing came at the commencement of the loud cry. As we have already seen, the 144,000 are therefore the first fruits, the first to be sealed. Tract number 1 on page 20. It says, since the purification or the sealing came, the sealing of the 144,000 came. When? At the commencement of the loud cry. Now, brothers and sisters, here we can easily understand that the 11th hour message is divided into two sections. The 11th hour message before the loud cry, and the 11th hour message at the commencement of the loud cry. Now, what is the 11th hour message? I would like to read again the statement in 2SR 230 and 231. What is the message? The 11th hour message is none other than Revelation 18, the loud cry of the third angel. Or in other words, the particular object in view. When we study the 11th hour message, it is directly applied to the loud cry of the third angel's message. Now, brothers and sisters, does the loud cry of the third angel's message occurred in the days of Beti-Hotep? Brothers and sisters, the shepherd's rod declared clearly. I would like to read to you. Here in White House Recruiter, on page 65 and page 66. White House Recruiter, on page 65 and page 66. It says, in these pages, brethren, God's burden appeal to you represents only a small part of the 11th hour message that is now sounding throughout Laodicea. It says, like the clear ringing of a fire alarm commingled with church chimes. Will you not with Isaiah respond to the voice of the Lord and resolutely say, here am I, send me. Isaiah 6, verse 8. When does this message have been proclaimed? Brothers and sisters, the White House Recruiter, 1951. Now, the prophet declared clearly that the message that they have been proclaimed in the Laodicean church is only a small part of the 11th hour message. Here's another testimony given by the prophet. One symbolic code, number 6, page 10. One symbolic code, number 6, page 10. Concerning the angel of Revelation 18, verse 1, with whose glory the earth is to be lightened. We do not claim to have as yet all his light. We do not claim to have as yet all his light. One symbolic code, number 6, page 10. Now, to all honest, faithful, sincere shepherd's rod believer, please read again and again the statement in White House Recruiter, page 39. It says, all who have perused these pages to this point have surely become aware of the fact that even this very restricted representation of the additional message, that of the judgment of the living, gives in itself tremendous power and force to the three angels' messages. Then this is the question, it says, but in what way is it to give absolute power and force to them? But in what way is it to give absolute power and force to them? First, by bringing to light the heretofore unrevealed aspects of the judgment. Now, this is the question. Does all the aspects that pertains to the judgment had been completely revealed in the days of Beti-Hotep? Because that statement is very clear. That the third angel's message will never swell into a loud cry, give absolute power and force, not until all the unrevealed aspects of the judgment will be completely unfolded. He himself says that in their lifetime, according here in Answerer number 1, on page 95, I would like to read to you. It says, so while it was not exactly understood beforehand what the nature of the event would be, what nature of the event mentioned here? It is concerning when the judgment of the dead will close and the judgment of the living begins. BTOTF says it was not exactly understood. His own testimony says in page 94, let us read. It says, in the statement in question, the rod has no reference to the investigative judgment. So it's concerning the investigative judgment. The message sets no date, either exact or approximate, for the closing of the judgment of the dead, or for the beginning of the judgment of the living. The time of the cessation of the one event and the beginning of the other is not to be known until the one is past and the other begun. Why? Because it is inscribed in present tense. If God would reveal to BTOTF the knowledge concerning the judgment that pertains to the living, while in reality it was still future in his days, then such revelation would be grammatically incorrect. How could BTOTF and his associates could proclaim the judgment that pertains to the living is in progress? Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come, inscribed in present tense, while in reality it was still future in His days. Then such revelation, according to the shepherd's rod, would be grammatically incorrect. The shepherd's rod plainly told us here in 1 SR page 156 and 157, it says, God did not intend to make the judgment known until after the hour had come. 1 SR 156, 157. God did not intend to make the judgment known until after the hour had come. For this reason, inspiration inscribed the occurrence in present tense is come in order to be grammatically correct. 1 SR page 156 and 157. But the shepherd's rod plainly declared in 2TG number 12. Let's read again the statement. 2TG number 12, page 29. It says, fear God. I would like to begin in the upper portion. The revelation, moreover, in the following verses again and again endeavors to make us see that the event there portrayed is the judgment in session. Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come. What judgment? Investigative judgment. What is the investigative judgment? That is the harvest. That is the sealing of the 144,000, which came at the commencement of the loud cry. Then it says, John truly penned it as a prophecy, but when it actually takes place, then God's agency on earth, there is agency of such revelation. What is that agency? The spirit of prophecy in the church is to proclaim that the event has actually taken place. But what church? That is the 11th hour church. In the judgment that pertains to the dead, the church that proclaim that the judgment that pertains to the dead is in session is the 9th hour church. But the church that will proclaim that the judgment that pertains to the living is in progress must be the 11th hour church. So in this study, we can easily understand that when God raised up the 11th hour church, indicates that the church, which is the 9th hour, her period is already past. What is the period? The period in proclaiming the judgment that pertains to the dead. Then God raised up the 11th hour church in the judgment that pertains to the living to proclaim that the judgment is in progress. And here the shepherd's rod declared clearly in answerer number 1, page 95. So while it was not exactly understood beforehand, so that is the testimony of the prophet, it was not exactly understood in their days what the nature of the event would be. Yet, when the fullness of the time came, and no other event occurred but this one, it was thereby identified as the one predicted in Ezekiel chapter 4 in connection with the end of the 430 prophetic years when the scroll was to unroll another turn. Hoping that we could completely understand the 430 years in different aspects. But at this time, brethren, I am just trying to explain that the loud cry proclamation is first applied to the sealing of the 144,000. A loud cry message to all the saints that will no longer to taste death. And that loud cry is not made of a lot of noise. It says here in 1 TG number 15, on page 19 and page 20. The author of these statements makes clear that the loud cry is not made by a lot of noise, but by an additional message. What is that additional message? Brethren, if the only message that we have is the message which was imparted to us by B.T. Hotep, then we have no additional message. It says here on 2SR page 93, it says, thus, not one of these churches have had additional light on the scriptures other than that which was imparted to them by the founders of its movements. 2SR page 93. Who is he, the founder of the movement of the Davidian? B.T. Hotep. Thus, the message that you have to this present time is only the message that was imparted to us by B.T. Hotep. Then we have no additional light, according to the shepherd's rod. This additional light is the final outpouring of present truth. The present truth under the judgment that pertains to the living, the seventh seal. And this message, according to White House Recruiter, page 34, I would like to read. It says here, White House Recruiter, page 34, it says, with the completed judgment message during the 11th hour. When does the judgment message will be completed? It is during the 11th hour. Let us distinctly separate the proclamation of the 11th hour message. Because the proclamation of the 11th hour message is divided into two sections. The proclamation before the loud cry and the proclamation during the loud cry. Or in other words, the proclamation of the 11th hour message before the commencement of the period of the judgment that pertains to the living, and that proclamation is in the days of B.T. Hotep. What is the 11th hour message? Judgment that pertains to the living. And that is the message that had been proclaimed by B.T. Hotep. It says here in White House Recruiter, page 21, now that for the first time, the parable is ablaze with light, none but the eye that is hopelessly gone out in dungeon darkness can fail to see distinctly that the message with which we Seventh-day Adventists were entrusted in 1844 at the 9th hour is not the 11th hour message, not the message of the judgment of the living, but rather only the judgment of the dead. What is the 11th hour message? The judgment of the living. Does B.T. Hotep proclaim the judgment of the living? Absolutely, yes. So B.T. Hotep is proclaiming the 11th hour message. Yes, that is the proclamation of the 11th hour message prior to the commencement of the period of the 11th hour. And that is B.T. Hotep says that only a small part that had been proclaimed. That is his own testimony. In White House Recruiter, page 65. It says, in these pages, brethren, God's burden appeal to you represents only a small part of the 11th hour message that is now sounding throughout Laodicea like the clear ringing for a fire alarm commingled with church chimes. We do not, with Isaiah, respond to the voice of the Lord and resolutely say, here am I, send me. Isaiah 6, verse 8. Not all that pertains to the 11th hour. What is the 11th hour? The judgment of the living. And what is the first aspect of the judgment? Bookworm. And to repeat again, brothers and sisters, that statement in Revelation 11, verse 1, saying, measure the temple, the altar, and the worshippers through the rod that had been given, that is the last messenger. To measure the temple, the altar, and the worshipper is to know all the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary, by which such proceedings it was not clearly understood in the days of B.T. Hotep. He himself testified in Answerer number 1, page 95. So, brothers and sisters, we'll continue this subject on our next episode, hoping that God would help us and God would bless us. The time is fast running out, and we need, brethren, to hold the present truth. Be certain that before you sigh and cry, the present truth is in your possession. Thank you very much. May the good Lord bless you, and have a beautiful, wonderful evening.